Hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're writing, I'll begin. On July 16, 1338, the young English monarch Edward III of the House of Plantagenet prepared to set sail with his army from the port of Walton. The reason for the military mobilization, as Edward believed, was an exceptionally lofty goal several years earlier. His dynastic rights to the French throne had been rudely rejected. The dynastic dispute, almost commonplace for feudal Europe, this time served merely as a pretext. Behind it lay deeper Anglo-French contradictions, which ultimately erupted into a series of protracted military clashes, becoming classics of European military history. Today, they are known as the 100 Years' War. The starting point for the complex intertwining of English and French history was the events of the mid-11th century. In 1066, the Norman feudal Lord William landed with an army on the southern coast of England. As the Duke of Normandy, William recognized the suzerainty of the French king, but as the King of England, he had equal status with him. In other words, the English monarch became the full-fledged ruler of two lands. During the reign of Henry II Plantagenet, England's territorial holdings reached their peak, dozens of times larger than the personal domains of the French crown. Since Henry came from the Angevin dynasty, historians later called his realm the Angevin Empire. However, the legal anomaly persisted within France. Henry remained a vassal of Louis VII and was obliged to swear fealty to him. In the following decades, the French kings did everything possible to dismantle the Angevin Empire. Philip II Augustus over several decades wrested from the Plantagenets most of their continental possessions, except for the southwestern region Gascony. Gascony, a rich wine-producing, artisanal, and trading region, was of exceptional importance to the English crown by the beginning of the 14th century. It brought in up to £50 an annual income of some close to the total revenue to the treasury from all of England. Particularly valuable were the wine duties. Gascon wines were taxed twice upon export from Bordeaux, and upon import to England bringing in about £12,000 annually. However, the benefits of monopoly access to the English market covered any cost for the Gascons. Under Plantagenet rule, Gascony prospered, and its population closely tied its fate to the English kingdom. When, at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th centuries, the French tried to seize the duchy by force, they encountered stubborn resistance from local feudal lords and urban communes, ready to defend their economic ties with England with weapons. The tense situation in Gascony left no doubt that sooner or later, the French southwest would become the cause and location of a large-scale military conflict between England and France. Therefore, the monarchies actively sought allies on the Iberian Peninsula. The French secured the loyalty of Navarre and in 1288 concluded an alliance with Aragon, which at the end of the 13th century was rapidly becoming a powerful Mediterranean power. Although the alliance treaty between the two countries was ultimately not formalized in writing, theoretically Aragon could be considered an ally of the French crown. Apart from the Iberian Peninsula, the rival monarchies also sought allies in other regions. Writing. I'll begin. On July 16, 1338, the young English monarch Edward III of the House of Plantagenet prepared to set sail with his army from the port of Walton. The reason for the military mobilization, as Edward believed, was an exceptionally lofty goal several years earlier. His dynastic rights to the French throne had been rudely rejected. The dynastic dispute, almost commonplace for feudal Europe, this time served merely as a pretext. Behind it lay deeper Anglo-French contradictions, which ultimately erupted into a series of protracted military clashes, becoming classics of European military history. Today, they are known as the 100 Years' War. The starting point for the complex intertwining of English and French history was the events of the mid-11th century. In 1066, the Norman feudal Lord William landed with an army on the southern coast of England. As the Duke of Normandy, William recognized the suzerainty of the French king, but as the King of England, he had equal status with him. In other words, the English monarch became the full-fledged ruler of two lands. During the reign of Henry II Plantagenet, England's territorial holdings reached their peak, dozens of times larger than the personal domains of the French crown. Since Henry came from the Angevin dynasty, historians later called his realm the Angevin Empire. However, the legal anomaly persisted within France. Henry remained a vassal of Louis VII and was obliged to swear fealty to him. In the following decades, the French kings did everything possible to dismantle the Angevin Empire. Philip II Augustus over several decades wrested from the Plantagenets most of their continental possessions, except for the southwestern region Gascony. Gascony, a rich wine-producing, artisanal, and trading region, was of exceptional importance to the English crown by the beginning of the 14th century. It brought in up to £50 an annual income of some close to the total revenue to the treasury from all of England. Particularly valuable were the wine duties. Gascon wines were taxed twice upon export from Bordeaux, and upon import to England, bringing in about £12,000 annually. However, the benefits of monopoly access to the English market covered any cost for the Gascons. Under Plantagenet rule, Gascony prospered, and its population closely tied its fate to the English kingdom. When, at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th centuries, the French tried to seize the duchy by force, they encountered stubborn resistance from local feudal lords and urban communes, ready to defend their economic ties with England with weapons. The tense situation in Gascony left no doubt that sooner or later, the French southwest would become the cause and location of a large-scale military conflict between England and France. Therefore, the monarchies actively sought allies on the Iberian Peninsula. The French secured the loyalty of Navarre and in 1288 concluded an alliance with Aragon, which at the end of the 13th century was rapidly becoming a powerful Mediterranean power. Although the alliance treaty between the two countries was ultimately not formalized in writing, theoretically Aragon could be considered an ally of the French crown. Apart from the Iberian Peninsula, the rival monarchies also sought allies in other regions. A more valuable partner than Castile was found by the French in the north at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th centuries. The Kingdom of Scotland desperately fought the English for independence, leading to the formation of a Franco-Scottish alliance. Now, in case of war, Scotland was to attack England from the north, and the Plantagenets would have to fight on two fronts. The English, in turn, tried to win over the Count of Flanders. Apart from the natural desire to counterbalance the Franco-Scottish alliance, there were strategic reasons. English wool and English ships became the key condition for the development of cloth making, the leading industry of Flemish craftsmanship. The urban communes of Ypres, Ghent, and Bruges, closely linked with English merchants, took a staunch anti-French position, making Flanders a convenient bridgehead for the English to invade France. Finally, in medieval European politics, the Pope and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire played important roles. In 1309, the Avignon papacy began. The seat of the Holy See moved from Rome to Avignon, where French authorities could easily control the election of the new pontiff. Consequently, the Pope's pro-French orientation was beyond doubt. German emperors, on the contrary, mainly adhered to a pro-English line. Thus, the long-standing contradictions between the English and French crowns by the beginning of the 14th century remained unresolved. Moreover, the clash of English and French interests in Gascony and Flanders deepened, acquiring a solid economic foundation. On the international stage, the Anglo-French confrontation led to the formation of large military political blocs around the rival states. Western Europe stood on the threshold of a major military conflict, needing only a spark to ignite. Such a spark was the dynastic crisis in France. All three sons of Philip IV, the fair Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, who successively occupied the throne, left no male heirs. After the death of Charles IV, the last representative of the Capetian dynasty, his cousin Philip of Valois became regent. Philip convened an assembly of French nobility to resolve the issue of succession. His claim to the crown was based on being the grandson of one king and cousin of three others. However, the situation was complicated by the fact that Charles IV's own sister, Isabella, wife of the English King Edward II, also asserted her rights to the throne. By all rules of inheritance, Isabella had more grounds to claim the throne, but her candidacy met sharp resistance. Never before had a woman ruled in France. The French aristocrats justified the rejection of Isabella's dynastic claims with a Salic law, according to which the throne could not be passed through the female line. Isabella's representatives at the assembly declared that if a woman was forbidden to occupy the throne, then this prohibition should not apply to her son Edward III, Philip IV's closest male line relative. However, the French aristocrats did not want the throne to go to a representative of the English dynasty, and Philip of Valois was proclaimed king, entering history as Philip VI. The rejected Edward III had no intention of giving up his claims. Crowned at a young age, 3 years later, in 1330, he removed his mother Isabella and her favorite Mortimer from power. In the 1330s, Edward actively prepared for war over the French crown, inflicted a series of defeats on the Scots, and concluded an alliance with the German emperor. The French prepared for war less energetically. They were reassured by the guaranteed support of the Pope and the entrenched notion of the invincibility of French knightly cavalry. Taking advantage of Edward being occupied with the war against Scotland, the French king in May 1337 announced the confiscation of Gascony. In France, they clearly underestimated England's readiness for a major conflict, believing it would be limited to another local war in the southwest. However, the time for a decisive clash was ripe, presenting himself as a victim of Philip of Valois' schemes. Edward asserted his claim to the French throne and declared war on France. To reinforce his claims, Edward ordered the inclusion of the emblem of the House of Capet, the royal fleur-de-lis, into his own coat of arms. In Paris, these heraldic manipulations were seen as a direct insult to the French crown. This meant that the armies of the two kingdoms were inevitably destined to meet in military confrontation on the battlefields. Over the 300 years during which the tangle of Anglo-French contradictions formed, military organization in both kingdoms underwent serious changes. The old method of army recruitment, the feudal levy, where a lord called upon his vassals, became a thing of the past, replaced by a contract system. A written contract was concluded in the king's name with a captain hired for service. It specified the size of the salary, a bonus upon completion of service, compensation for lost horses, payment for equipment transport, and conditions regarding war booty, for example, who could take prisoners and who should ransom them. The entire unit's salary was paid to the captain, who then distributed it among the soldiers. The existence of the contract system was the main similarity between the English and French armies on the eve of the 100 Years' War. However, there were also important differences. In the French army, the heavy knightly cavalry remained the key element. Armored horsemen dominated the battlefields, and their crushing charge more than once brought the French victory. The only stain on the reputation of French chivalry was the Battle of the Golden Spurs, Courtrai in 1302, when Flemish militia, to the astonishment of Europe, held their ground against heavily armed horsemen thanks to firm discipline. However, in France, this defeat was not taken seriously, considered a regrettable accident. The emphasis on the knightly component led to the French infantry having poor training. Understanding this, the French preferred to hire infantry abroad, for example, They readily employed Genoese crossbowmen. Unlike the French, in the English army the role of heavily armed horsemen gradually declined due to a shortage of land for the nobility and the difficulties of waging war in the mountains of Scotland and Wales. Against the backdrop of the decline of heavy cavalry, the role of archers armed with the longbow increased. This powerful and inexpensive weapon was adopted by the English from the Welsh and quickly spread throughout the country. According to an ordinance of 1252, all subjects of the English king owning land worth at least £1 were required to acquire a longbow and practice shooting weekly. Thus, a large reserve of skilled archers formed in England, ready to go to war at any moment. However, the longbow became the cornerstone of English tactics only on the eve of the 100 Years' War, when the English learned to fully exploit its main advantage: high rate of fire, up to 10 shots per minute, and the ability to conduct massed area bombardment. For this, foot archers were positioned on the flanks, with infantry, spearmen, and dismounted knights occupying the space between them. When the enemy approached, a concentrated hail of arrows would fall on their flanks, forcing them to shift towards the center, narrowing their front. This is precisely what happened at the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 between the English and the Scots. The Scots, with numerical superiority, attacked, were caught in a downpour of arrows, and fled, barely reaching the English positions. The new tactic proved so effective that the casualty ratio was frightening. The Scots lost at least 1,000 men, the English only 14. However, battles with the Scots were merely a warm-up. Soon the English archers were to face the famed French chivalry. Despite the official declaration of war, hostilities in 1337 were limited to reconnaissance operations and coastal raids. The English crown in those years suffered from a chronic shortage of funds, and Edward was only able to complete preparations for war in August 1338. It was too late to invade France, so upon arrival in Antwerp, the king used the time for diplomatic maneuvers in the Netherlands, securing the support of local feudal lords, after which he went to Koblenz, where in September, the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV the Bavarian proclaimed Edward suzerain of all imperial possessions west of the Rhine. Even Edward's clumsy refusal to kiss the emperor's foot did not spoil the ceremony. The next year saw the first large-scale invasion of northern France by the English army. Advancing through Picardy, the English king, as a chronicler noted, set 1,000 villages ablaze and caused great devastation. However, things went no further. News of the approaching French army forced Edward to halt. Both armies froze by order of their sovereigns, who exchanged accusatory letters and threats of single combat. Philip VI was cautious. Victory in battle would not bring him great benefits, while the risks were high. For Edward, a war of attrition was ruinous. His Dutch allies were going home, and debts were growing. In the end, the king's financial situation deteriorated so much that in Bruges he had to pawn his own crown, leave several aristocrats and Queen Philippa as hostages, and depart the continent without money to avoid becoming a hostage of the bankers himself. Returning to London in February 1340, Edward used all his eloquence to convince parliamentarians of the need for a new emergency tax. The king's colossal military expenditures already caused mass discontent, and Edward needed to force a battle upon the French in the shortest possible time. An opportunity soon presented itself. In June 1340, as Edward was preparing to set sail with the treasury and reinforcements, news reached him that the French fleet was heading towards Sluys to cut off supply routes for the English army on the continent. Despite his advisors' objections, Edward moved his fleet to intercept. On June 24, 1340, the English approached the Flemish coast and saw the enemy's ships formed in 3 lines and linked by chains. Edward also ranged his ships in a line, placing boarding parties on board and archer ships on the sides. Waiting for the tide and a favorable wind, Edward went on the offensive. In the ensuing battle, the English captured ship after ship, while archers delivered volley fire, sweeping the French from the decks. Seeing this, Panic began in the second and third French lines. The final blow was an unexpected attack by Edward's Flemish supporters. On the rear of the French flotilla, caught in a vice, only 17 of the 200 French ships managed to leave the battlefield. The success achieved its slides needed to be developed, but the 1340 land campaign proved unsuccessful. English troops slowly advanced through Flanders, and the siege of Tournai dragged on. The international situation also became more complicated in the north. The Scots became active again, and the Pope, through political intrigue, destroyed Edward's alliance with Louis the Bavarian. All this, along with the ongoing financial crisis, forced the parties to conclude a truce. The actual continuation of the war under the truce became clashes in Brittany. In April 1341, the childless Duke of Brittany, John III, died. On his deathbed, he refused to name an heir, provoking a dynastic crisis. Providing aid to claimants the deceased brother and the husband of his niece Philip VI, and Edward III fought over an important strategic bridgehead in the paused Anglo-French War. In 1341 to 1343, active hostilities took place in Brittany, ending in England's success. In 1345, Edward, having secured the north, resumed military operations in southwestern France. The English army fought its way to Angoulême, besieged and took the city, scoring another victory over the French in Brittany. The French army's counterstrike came only in the spring of 1346, but already in July, before the French could consolidate success in the southwest, a large English army led by Edward landed in northern France. The breadth of the theater of operations and their intensity testified to the decisive intentions of the English king. The English army advanced quickly through Normandy, devastating it. It met its first serious resistance in Caen, which was taken, looted, and burned, bringing Edward, according to the chronicler, great wealth. The plundering of the local population benefited Edward doubly. It not only improved his financial situation, but also damaged the reputation of Philip of Valois, exposing him as incapable of protecting his subjects. Moving along the left bank of the Seine, bypassing fortified cities, Edward reached the suburbs of Paris on August 12th. The French chronicler Jean de Venette, an eyewitness, wrote that from the capital's fortress towers, endless smoke from fires was visible. Philip, meanwhile, arrived with his army north of Paris, where he listened to advice on further actions. The king was in a difficult position. The hope that Edward would run out of money proved unfounded, and the fighting in Brittany and Gascony promised no quick success. Meanwhile, Edward, after a show of force at the walls of Paris, fought his way across the Seine and led his troops through Picardy towards Flanders. Picardy was also devastated. The advance of the English army was accompanied by fires, killings, and looting. Only at the end of August, when Edward burned many villages on the right bank of the Somme, did Philip decide to attack. After years of maneuver warfare, the two armies finally met in northern France, near the village of Crécy, choosing a site for the battle. Edward settled on a valley northeast of Crécy and Ponthieu. A hill sloped down to an old Roman road, and on the other side was a forest. The uneven slopes greatly hindered attacks on the English, and the village, located on both sides of the hill, prevented flank encirclement. Moreover, the king ordered many pits dug along the entire front and barricades of wagons built on the left flank. The size of Edward's army at Crécy is estimated at 12,000 to 15,000 men upon landing in Normandy, though by the time of the battle it had shrunk by 15 to 20% due to non-combat losses. Of the remaining, about 4,000 were knights and heavy infantry, 4,000 light auxiliary units, and the rest were archers. Edward's army consisted of three large formations of battles. The front line was formed by the dismounted battles under the command of the Earl of Northampton and the king's son Edward of Woodstock, nicknamed the Black Prince. English archers were concentrated on the flanks and in the gaps between the battles. Their positions were advanced forward to widen the firing angle. On the extreme left flank, Edward placed several primitive firearms. Their combat value was almost zero, but the roar could cause confusion among the enemy. The king himself, with the 3rd Reserve Battle, positioned himself by a windmill at the rear. On the morning of August 26, 1346, the English army was drawn up and ready for battle. The size of the French forces is estimated at about 30,000, though this figure is approximate. It is known for certain that Philip's army included a contingent of Genoese crossbowmen. The numerous French army stretched for tens of kilometers, and only the most organized units of the heavy knightly cavalry and Genoese mercenaries reached Crécy. The day was already waning. Many commanders advised Philip to postpone the battle to allow the army to rest after the long march. Philip agreed and ordered the vanguard to halt. However, the troops following behind received the order with displeasure. The thirst for battle spread to the king's headquarters, where hotheads convinced him to finish off the invaders here and now. The army was seized by such an impulse that postponing the battle seemed impossible. The French forces formed up in 3 battles, one behind the other. The first included Genoese crossbowmen and horsemen under the command of Philip's ally, John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia. The second battle contained the elite of French cavalry, including the most prominent nobles, under the command of the king's younger brother, the Count of Alençon. The third battle, led by the king himself, commanded the remaining cavalry contingents. Around 6 p.m., Philip's forces began their advance. To the sound of drums and trumpets, the Genoese crossbowmen began to approach the English positions. At that moment, a short but intense rain passed over the field, due to which, as Jean de Venette reports, the bowstrings of many crossbows got wet. Having crossed the valley and finding themselves about 250 meters from the enemy, the crossbowmen attempted a few volleys but with little success. The wet bowstrings reduced their range, and aiming uphill was difficult. The English, however, had prudently removed the strings from their bows during the rain and were now ready to respond. Over the next 30 seconds, a hail of 7,000 arrows fell upon the crossbowmen. The English archers did not need to pick specific targets. The density of fire guaranteed hits. The Genoese suffered significant losses, and the lack of infantry shields, left with the baggage train, left them defenseless. To top it off, Edward ordered the primitive firearms on the left flank into action. Just a few volleys were enough to scatter the mercenaries' ranks. The Italians began to retreat, but their path was blocked by the French cavalry of the second battle. Their leader, the Count of Alençon, seeing the crossbowmen's failure, shouted, "Kill this rabble. They are in our way." His horsemen mercilessly rode through the Genoese, cutting down the fugitives. The 2 French battles colliding in the valley became a perfect target for the English archers, who fired continuously in a high arc, inflicting severe wounds on men and horses. Finally, individual detachments of knightly cavalry began to emerge from the chaos and, with characteristic French impulsiveness, charged up the hill under the continuous hail of arrows. The heavy horsemen engaged in fierce combat with the English ranks, but despite all their determination, they failed to break the defense on the high ground. The horses refused to charge a wall of men, and the archers continued to shower the attackers with arrows. French losses grew rapidly, but with the approach of new detachments, the pressure intensified. In total, during the battle, the French launched about 15 attacks, each marked by ferocity. Particular pressure was felt on the right English battle, where command was effectively in the hands of the Black Prince's mentor, Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. Here, such a fierce struggle unfolded that the Earl grew concerned for the prince's life and requested reinforcements from Edward. However, the king felt the moment had not yet come to commit the reserve. The French chronicler Jean Froissart reproduced a dialogue between the English king and a knight arriving from the Earl of Warwick. "Dear sir, I am sent by those who guard the prince, your son. They inform me they fear the military might of the French may overcome them, for it is too great." "And my son?" asked the king. "In what state is he?" "In God's name, "Sir," replied the knight, "he is still strong, sound, and of good spirit." "Then," said the king, "go back to those who sent you and tell them from me that for a young man, the hour has come to win his spurs." One of the symbols of the battle was the attack of the blind king of Bohemia, John of Luxembourg. Learning of the chaos in the allied ranks, the sightless monarch turned to his knights. "Gentlemen, you are my liegemen, my friends and my companions. I pray and beseech you, as you are true knights, to lead me so far forward that I may strike a blow with my sword." The king's attendants linked their horses' reins together so as not to separate, and moved into the attack. When they wedged into the enemy ranks, darkness was already descending upon the valley. Soldiers from the Black Prince's battle bravely met the German and Bohemian knights. In the twilight, heraldic devices were indistinguishable, and the English mercilessly dispatched the king and his retinue, not realizing how high-ranking a noble had engaged them in combat. By the time the French defeat became obvious, the English reserve cavalry, which the king finally sent into attack, moved forward. The approaching horsemen provoked a large-scale French retreat, and Philip VI himself, surrounded by his close associates, got into a skirmish in which he was wounded in the face by an arrow. With the onset of night, the sounds of battle died down, and the English, exhausted by the hours-long confrontation, remained to spend the night on the hill, not yet fully realizing the extent of their victory. The next morning, scribes counted the bodies on the battlefield. English losses were small. According to Froissart, 3 knights and 20 archers died. Though modern researchers distrust these figures, French losses were catastrophic. 1,540 to heavily armed horsemen fell, the flower of French chivalry. Among the dead were princes of the blood, including Philip's nephew the Count of Blois and the Count of Flanders, Louis I of Nevers. They were solemnly buried together with the fallen English, while the rest were thrown into huge mass graves dug by peasants. After the success at Crécy, the English army continued its march through northern France. Despite local resistance and Philip's attempts to lift the siege, the city of Calais fell and for 200 years became a base for English raids. Events on the English Channel coast influenced not only the course of the war, but also the domestic political situation. The initial successes dispelled the clouds of discontent with Edward caused by the heavy tax burden, while Philip VI lost the remainder of his subjects' support. In 1346, luck was on England's side, but everything could change. After the victory at Crécy, the initiative in the 100 Years' War passed to England. However, more important than the battle's strategic significance was its psychological impact. News of the victory instantly spread across Europe, causing a sensation. Europeans were struck by the fact that the king of a mighty power was defeated by the English, a people until recently taken lightly. The authority of the French royal house was shaken, and the victorious Edward rested on his laurels. Subsequent events would show whether the English could consolidate their success. After the defeat at Crécy, the French begged the Scottish King David II to distract the English. True to the alliance, David invaded northern England, but underestimated the enemy and suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Neville's Cross, being captured. This took Scotland out of the war for a long time. Simultaneously, Edward completed the prolonged siege of Calais. However, soon war had to be forgotten. An epidemic of plague arrived in Europe, brought by Geno's ships from Marseille. The Black Death spread rapidly, killing between a third and half of the population. The population decline led to reduced tax collection and impoverishment. The former population levels were only restored by the 16th century. The epidemic limited large-scale operations, but the war smoldered. At the end of 1349, the French tried to bribe the commander of Calais, but he immediately reported it to Edward. The king rushed to France with a small detachment and thwarted the surrender attempt. However, the Castilian fleet, active at sea, hampered unrestricted trade and troop movements across the Channel. In the summer of 1350, Edward intercepted it off the coast of England and in the naval battle of Winchelsea, defeated it. cutting it in half. At this time, Edward the Black Prince was gaining fame. The origin of his nickname remains a mystery. It may be related to the black color of his armor, or his black reputation among the French. Those sources do not confirm this. The Black Prince preferred armor covered in red velvet. The only clue is a tournament shield with 3 ostrich feathers on a black background. But in battles he used the family coat of arms. From the age of 13, Edward accompanied his father on campaigns, fought bravely at Crecy, and was knighted. Contemporaries called him the noblest of nobles. But behind the admiring remarks hid less pleasant qualities: extravagance, poor financial management, and a readiness to give cities over to his soldiers for plunder. In France, the domestic political situation did not improve. In 1350, Philip VI died, leaving a kingdom exhausted by war and plague to his son John II. The new king promised to wage war to a victorious end and took unpopular steps, imposed high taxes, and conducted a partial devaluation, reducing the silver content in coins. Inflation and military defeats in Aquitaine and Brittany turned the masses, clergy, and part of the aristocracy against John. All these layers rallied around Charles the Bad, King of Navarre and a descendant of the Capetians through the female line. Formally, Charles had a stronger claim to the French throne than Edward III. But at that moment he was only interested in champagne, taken from his mother by Philip VI. Arriving in Paris, Charles began to weave intrigues. In 1354, he organized the murder of the king's favorite, Charles de la Cerda, after which he entered into negotiations with Edward, promising military aid against John. Meanwhile, preparations for a new round of hostilities were underway in England. Edward planned 3 simultaneous strikes. One army under his leadership would attack from the north. Another under Henry of Lancaster would land in Normandy, and a third led by the Black Prince would operate on the southern theater. However, if the high feudal lords still remembered the dynastic goals of the war, the motives of ordinary soldiers were more down to earth. By the 1350s, the English had perfected the tactic of destructive raids on enemy territory, called chevauchés, originally meaning simply a ride on horseback. Over time, it became a military term implying a mounted raid to undermine the enemy's economy. During the 100 Years' War, the chevauchée also acquired a political connotation. The devastation of territory was to show locals that their lord could not protect them and encourage them to change allegiance. Usually, chevauchées were carried out by small detachments ranging from several dozen to 1,000 men. All participants moved on horseback for mobility, and the baggage train was minimized. Upon reaching a village or town, the detachment suppressed resistance, gathered everything valuable, drove off livestock, burned houses, barns, mills, and poured out wine. The real prizes were wealthy cities. Starting from 1346, trophies and money were delivered to England. According to the chronicler, now in England there was no woman without clothing, jewelry, or dishes from Calais and other French cities. The planned triple chevauchée for 1355 failed. Edward, having landed in Calais, returned to England due to Scottish activity. Henry of Lancaster's army did not leave port due to bad weather. The only one to launch hostilities that year was the Black Prince. In September, he landed at Bordeaux with an army consisting of 1,700 horsemen, archers, and several hundred Welsh spearmen. Gascon contingents under the command of Jean de Grailly, Captal de Butch, joined him. At a war council, they decided to conduct the chevauchée through the lands of Jean d'Armagnac, who had himself invaded English possessions repeatedly. Setting out from the foothills of the Pyrenees towards the Rhine River, the English took and looted Agen and then other cities. When Captal de Butch's detachment approached Lisson, the population had already fled. The nobles remaining in the castle were taken prisoner. Fortified cities like Miranda, the Black Prince bypassed. In a week and a half, the Anglo-Gascon army devastated the rich county. Jean d'Armagnac concentrated his forces in Toulouse, destroyed bridges across the Rhine, but could not stop Edward's advance. The army's movement was accompanied by smoke from fires by day and the glow by night. On November 3rd, the Black Prince approached Carcassonne, whose fortress was one of the strongest medieval fortifications. But the city quarters on the opposite bank of the river were defenseless. The townspeople offered a huge ransom of 250,000 gold ducats. But Edward refused to bargain with rebels and, leaving, set the city on fire. The next target was Narbonne, a major trading city known since antiquity. The English occupied the city quarters, but the fortress bombarded them with ballista, forcing a retreat. The return march to Gascony became an ordeal. The path lay along rocky trails. Horses were given wine due to a lack of water. Jean d'Armagnac followed the English but dared not engage in battle. As a result of the 1355 campaign, the rich regions of southern France were devastated, and 20 cities, including Carcassonne and Narbonne, were destroyed. In late summer 1356, Edward had to choose a direction for a new strike. It was decided to leave several thousand soldiers in Gascony and move towards Bourges, to unite with Edward III. On August 4th, the Black Prince's army set out from Bergerac and quickly advanced through central French regions, destroying and burning everything around. Entering Berry, Edward's forces encountered stubborn resistance. Lussac-le-Château, Elise, and Saint-Benoît-du-Sault were taken by storm and looted, but the fortified Châteauroux the Black Prince bypassed. Gradually, the English approached the key Bourges, but Edward's actions became more cautious. He sent only a small detachment to Bourges, which devastated the surroundings, while he himself conducted an unsuccessful assault on Issoudun, after which he headed towards Vierzon, already captured by Capital de Butch's advanced detachment. Meanwhile, the situation in the north was heating up. King John arrested Charles the Bad, but Navarrese garrisons in Normandy remained loyal to their lord, causing John to get bogged down at the fortress of Breteuil. Considering that the Black Prince's troops were ravaging central regions, and Henry of Lancaster's army was moving to his aid from Brittany, John sought to avoid a prolonged siege. In the end, he bribed the garrison of Breteuil and hurried south to Chartres, where the French army was gathering. Edward, meanwhile, was moving through the Loire Valley to link up with Lancaster. But upon reaching Tours, he became convinced that crossing the Loire freely would be impossible and a retreat to Gascony was necessary, especially since the French king had begun pursuit. On September 13th, John arrived at Laux but learned that Edward had retreated to La Haye. The next day, when the French entered La Haye, the Black Prince was already at Châtellerault. Here Edward decided to take a 3-day break to establish contact with Lancaster, but the latter never managed to cross the Loire. Moreover, while Edward rested at Châtellerault, John, not knowing the enemy's exact location, bypassed him. The Black Prince's army broke camp and moved along the Vienne River on a narrow country road. Soon, a reconnaissance detachment under Capital de Butch returned and discovered a large French camp blocking the way. Upon receiving the report, Edward turned the army north, wishing to take up a defensive position. Crossing the river Maiassen at a ford, the army moved towards a small hill near Poitiers, which was almost the only suitable defensive position. Movement here was difficult due to vineyards, shrubs, hedges, ditches, and marshes. A hedge played a particular role, which could only be crossed into places wide enough only for carts. Stopping on the hill, the English began to dig in. They widened existing ditches, dug new ones, and on the right side, where the slope was gentle, built barricades of thorn bushes and wagons. The army was divided into 3 battles. The Earls of Warwick and Oxford held the slope towards the river and marsh on the left flank. The Earl of Salisbury with the Earl of Suffolk commanded the right side. Edward led the center. In the rear, the prince placed a small reserve detachments of knights and archers. Archers took up their traditional positions on the flanks. However, despite all preparations, Edward's army was exhausted. John received news of its location only on the morning of September 18th, and soon the royal army began forming battle lines opposite the English positions. But in the midst of preparations, Cardinal Heli de Talleyrand, whom the Pope had tasked with reconciling the parties, arrived at John's headquarters. At the Cardinal's initiative, the entire day was spent in negotiations. But Edward and John repeatedly rejected proposed terms, accusing the Cardinal of stalling. The only achievement was an agreement to cease hostilities for the day, allowing the sides to complete preparations. On the morning of September 19th, both armies took up battle positions. The size of the English army is estimated at 7,000 to 8,000 men, of which 6,000 were heavily armed horsemen dismounted for battle, and 1,000 each were archers and Gascon infantry. The size of the French army is exaggerated in many sources to 30,000. A more realistic figure is 11,000 to 12,000, including 8,000 cavalry, 2,000 mercenary crossbowmen, and about 1,000 light infantry. The French were arranged in 3 mounted battles, but unlike at Crécy, the crossbowmen were now concentrated on the flanks. Despite numerical superiority, the French faced a serious tactical problem. Attacking the English from the flanks was impossible, and a frontal cavalry charge was hindered by the landscape and vegetation. The moral factor also played a role. The French remembered the lesson of Crécy in the end. On advice, John decided to dismount all 3 battles and attack in tight infantry formation. Only 2 detachments of 250 knights each remained mounted on the flanks, tasked with engaging the English archers. Command of the mounted detachments was entrusted to 2 marshals of France, Jean de Clermont and Arnauld d'Adriem. The first dismounted battle was led by the king's son, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles V, who was 18. Military specialists, including William Douglas from Scotland, supported him. The second battle was under the command of the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans. The third under the leadership of John himself. From the French positions, it seemed the English were also preparing for battle, but in reality, the prince and his commanders had already decided to retreat. They planned to slip away south but kept the army in battle order in case of a French attack. Early in the morning, the Earl of Warwick's battle began moving towards the fort across the Meuse, but the baggage train got stuck on the narrow path. Around 9 a.m., news of the English retreat reached Arnauld d'Adriem, and he hastily sent a messenger to Jean de Clermont urging an attack. Clermont advised patience in response, but this did not stop Adriem, accusing Clermont of cowardice. He led his horsemen in an attack on the left English battle. It took the French horsemen time to reach the English positions, first ascending one hill, then climbing another. English archers unleashed volley fire, but most arrows harmlessly bounced off the armor of the riders and their horses. It seemed the French plan was working, but the Earl of Oxford found a solution. He ordered the archers to shift left into the marsh, where the horsemen could not reach them, and shoot from there at the unprotected sides of the horses. The result was immediate. As they climbed the slope, the horses suffered more and more wounds. Panic set in, and the riders turned to flight. When Adriem reached Warwick's infantrymen, his attack was already in its death throes. Within minutes, the English finished off the remnants of the detachment, and the marshal himself was captured. Simultaneously, on the left flank, the cavalry of Jean de Clermont, learning of his colleague's actions, also moved to attack but ran into a hedge and crowded in a narrow passage. The Earl of Salisbury hurried to block the passage with infantrymen, while archers, positioned safely, shot at the French from the sides. Soon, a small detachment of Gascon crossbowmen joined in, striking the armored men at short range. The remnants of the French detachment turned to flight, and Clermont was killed on the spot. While events unfolded on the flanks, the first French battle under the Dauphin moved against the English. Partial success accompanied the French on the right, where they managed to push back Salisbury's infantrymen, and only the arrival of reinforcements from the center corrected the situation. Near the Dauphin himself, in the confusion, his banner fell and the standard bearer was captured. dealing a moral blow. English archers could now move freely along the flanks, choosing firing positions. They unleashed such a storm of arrows on the French that, as Jean Froissart wrote, the French knew not where to turn to avoid their arrows. In the end, the Dauphin's advisors decided to withdraw, and the battle retreated in an organized manner. Learning of the failure, John doubted victory and ordered the Dauphin and his two sons to be led from the battlefield. This decision, combined with the retreat of the first line, could have convinced the Duke of Orleans, commander of the second battle, that the entire royal army was leaving, and he also retreated. However, knightly valor did not allow many French to leave the fight, and the royal battle was soon joined by knights from the first and second lines. "Banner forward," commanded the king, and the strengthened third battle with crossbowmen on the flanks moved into a final attack. While the French regrouped, the Black Prince's soldiers got a respite, the wounded were carried to the rear, and archers gathered arrows. However, the approach of the third battle forced them back to their positions. Realizing the army's capabilities were at their limit, the Black Prince made a famous tactical move. He sent Captal de Butch on a deep flanking maneuver to strike the French from the rear. Simultaneously, intensive skirmishing between archers and crossbowmen began on the flanks. As the chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker wrote, the thick ranks of the French obscured the sun with a cloud of crossbow bolts. But the young English archers replied with a deadly storm of arrows, having emptied their quivers. The archers with swords and shields rushed at the heavily armed French, desiring to sell their lives dearly. At the same time, the Black Prince gave the signal for a general advance. A desperate hand-to-hand fight began. While Captal de Butch was on the move, Edward sent another mounted detachment under Sir James Audley to strike the other flank. Audley successfully carried out the order, driving off the mounted crossbowmen and weakening the pressure on Warwick's battle. Simultaneously, on the right flank, the English pushed back and routed a detachment of German knights. In the center, the French, inspired by their king, fought fiercely. But their fate was sealed. Horsemen under de Butch appeared from behind the hill. The rear attack broke the enemy's morale. The third battle's formation began to crumble. Most of the French, especially on the flanks, fled, while the rest of the English mounted horses and began pursuit. The surrounded detachment of the king retreated towards the river Myosin. Describing the final moments of the battle, Froissart likely based his account on eyewitness recollections. At this time, there was a great press because of the constant desire to reach the king. Those who were nearest to him shouted, "Yield, yield, or you are dead." In that same place was a young knight, Denis de Morbic, who fought on the side of the English. He made his way through the crowd and said to the king, "Sire, sire, yield." The king, seeing himself in a hopeless situation, asked, "To whom should I yield?" "Where is my cousin, the Prince of Wales?" "Sire, he is not here, but yield to me, and I will take you to him," replied Morbic. "Who are you?" asked the king. "Sire, I am Denis de Morbic, a knight from Artois, but the first served the King of England, for France deprived me of all I had here." Then the king gave him his right glove and said, "I yield to you." The Battle of Poitiers was a tactical triumph for the Black Prince, but assessing losses statistically is difficult. No official lists survive. Geoffrey Le Baker names 16 noble French lords who died at Poitiers. Other sources give overall figures, about 2,000 heavily armed horsemen and 800 others killed. The intensity of the French attack suggests English losses were also significant, but their lists are also lost. After the victory at Poitiers, the captive John II was treated with honors and soon sailed to England on a ship. But his kingdom was dealt a terrible blow. The fragile unity of the country was broken. The domestic political situation rapidly slid towards anarchy. The next few years would become a period of severe trials for France. Eager to get out of captivity, John, still in Bordeaux, began negotiations with the Black Prince, promising to recognize all English territorial seizures, and also sent letters to France ordering the collection of funds for his ransom. However, John's subjects felt differently. In Paris, The assembled Estates General, the highest body of estate representation, agreed to replenish the treasury. But the money was not to go for the king's ransom but for waging war. The situation in Paris worsened. The urban population was gripped by discontent. Due to the ongoing crisis, the townspeople began to arm themselves, fortify walls, and erect barricades. In the end, the attempt by Etienne Marcel and the Estates General to limit the Dauphin's powers led to open conflict between Charles and the Parisians. In March 1358, after an attempt on his life, the Dauphin fled the capital. Paris came under the control of the rebels, who were against any negotiations with the English. Meanwhile, chaos grew in France. In the autumn of 1356, Henry de Grosmont besieged Rennes, the capital of Brittany. The old city walls were partially destroyed, but the inhabitants offered fierce resistance, repelled the assault, and collapsed a mine. Grosmont was not idle. He formed mounted detachments and sent them raiding through eastern Brittany, a neighboring provinces Anjou, Maine, and lower Normandy. These rich lands, most of which had never suffered invasion, were looted, and the population reduced to poverty. However, Grosmont failed to take Rennes. In the spring of 1357, he lifted the siege and curtailed military operations. But not every French region had its own Bertrand du Guesclin. Despite desperate resistance from the Normans, Anglo-Navarrese contingents captured fortress after fortress here. The Navarrese were especially active on the Cotentin Peninsula, which by 1357 had almost entirely come under their control. Soon the one for whom these captures were made appeared in November 1357. Supporters of Charles the Bad freed their king from imprisonment. Etienne Marcel immediately made contact with him, offering Charles the crown of France. However, Charles was a far-sighted politician and did not accept the crown from the hands of an enraged Parisian mob. A much greater problem for the local population than the Navarrese became the free companies, bands of mercenaries, or routiers. The collapse of the French administrative system led to these professional warriors turning to plunder en masse. Typically, a company would occupy a poorly defended castle and terrorize the surrounding area from there. Often, companies united under a single leader and devastated an entire region. This happened in the autumn of 1358, when an army of routiers under the English captain Robert Knowles invaded Burgundy and besieged the major trading city of Auxerre. The townspeople, who had recently expelled the garrison, held out for only a month. In May 1359, Knowles took the city. As historian Jonathan Sumption characterized it, Auxerre suffered a neat expropriation of urban property by professional and disciplined looters. The inhabitants had to pay a huge ransom. Even sacred relics from the Abbey of Saint-Germain were given as security, so the routiers would leave peacefully. The outrages of the routiers and the inaction of the authorities brought French peasants to the boiling point. Finally, their patience snapped, and the area around Paris was engulfed by the largest popular uprising in medieval France. Known as the Jacquerie, the uncontrolled wave of anger was directed primarily against the nobility, to whom the peasants owed duties, and against wealthy townspeople. Within days, the revolt spread to Champagne and Picardy, and its echo reached Burgundy, Lorraine, and Normandy. Terror and bloodshed reigned everywhere. Even eyewitnesses sympathetic to the movement reported senseless cruelty. The chronicler Jean de Venette, who did not hide his sympathy for the downtrodden, wrote, "All noble men they met, even their own lords, they killed and destroyed without mercy. The houses and fortresses of the nobility were razed to the ground. Noble ladies and young children were put to a miserable death. Surprisingly, it was the horrors of the Jacquerie that helped the French central authority emerge from the crisis. French, Navarrese, and Gascon feudal lords, previously at odds, quickly united in the face of the threat. Under the leadership of Charles the Bad, Franco-Navarrese knights crushed a large peasant army at the Battle of Mello. Charles the Bad personally led the defeat of the Jacquerie in battle under the walls of Meaux. In Paris, Etienne Marcel spoke in support of the Jacques, But this decision proved fatal for him. Parisian townspeople, fearing peasant wrath and tired of instability, turned away from him. On July 31st, 1358, a crowd of Parisians dealt with Marcel, expelled Charles the Bad's troops from the city, and invited the Dauphin, who 3 days later triumphantly entered the capital. By chance, the young Dauphin emerged victorious in the struggle for Paris. But the next year brought him new trials. In London, John II signed a monstrously harsh peace treaty in exchange for Edward III renouncing his claim to the French throne. John ceded to him roughly half of France, the entire southwest within the borders of Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Normandy, Poitou, and Calais. Such a treaty posed a serious threat to French independence. The Dauphin Charles, who had assumed the title of regent, refused to recognize the document. The enraged Edward, who had come so close to his goal, began preparing a new army for a decisive blow. The English king, with an army of 10,000, landed at Calais, marched through Picardy, and besieged Reims, where he planned to be crowned king of France. But the city's inhabitants offered stubborn resistance. The onset of a cold winter and lack of supplies forced the English to lift the siege, and Edward moved towards Paris, seeking surrender. The English mercilessly devastated the capital's suburbs, trying to lure the Dauphin into battle. But the city gates remained locked. The enraged king headed towards Chartres, sowing death and destruction. Finally, mutual exhaustion forced the sides to sit down for negotiations. In May 1360, an agreement was reached near Chartres at the place called Brittany. Edward received Aquitaine, Poitou, Périgord, and Calais in sovereign possession, and in return renounced his claim to the crown of France. For the release of the French king, an enormous ransom of £600,000 sterling was set, to be paid in installments. The king was allowed to return to France, leaving his 3 younger sons as hostages. Later, when in 1363 one of them fled to France without permission, John, honoring the treaty, returned to England, where he died a year later. The Peace of Brittany marked the end of the Edwardian phase of the war. English gains were huge, though Edward had to renounce his claim to the French throne. No one then knew that very soon Edward's achievements would be reversed. France owed its military revival in the 1360s to Charles of Valois, who was crowned in May 1364 and entered history with the nickname the Wise in his chivalric age. This ruler never participated in tournaments but possessed one of the largest libraries in Europe, 1,000 books, spending huge sums on acquiring ancient manuscripts. All his activities were aimed at recovering lost lands and restoring France's political might. First of all, Charles made energetic efforts to prevent the strengthening of his opponents Charles the Bad and Edward III in 1364. Charles the Bad again laid claim to Champagne and Burgundy and began gathering supporters in Normandy. A key one was Jean de Grailly, capital de Butch, hurrying to his aid with a detachment of English and Gascons. However, the French got ahead of them. Bertrand du Guesclin, whose military talent Charles the Wise recognized, dealt a series of blows to Navarre's fortresses, then blocked de Butch's path. On May 14, 1364, de Butch, finding himself trapped, ordered a retreat, which inadvertently provoked the Anglo-Gascon army to attack. Despite the relatively small size of both armies, the Battle of Caucherel was marked by ferocity and bloodshed. In the center, de Butch fought with a battle axe. Du Guesclin kept pace, personally slaying one of Charles the Bad's comrades. When it seemed the French would not hold, du Guesclin committed the Breton reserve. The Anglo-Gascon onslaught turned to flight. Jean de Grailly himself was wounded, knocked to the ground, and captured. Du Guesclin's success at Caucherel put an end to Charles the Bad's intrigues, and he retreated to his Puritan kingdom. However, it was too early to relax. That same year, the War of the Breton Succession entered its decisive phase. Formerly remaining aloof, Charles again sent Bertrand du Guesclin to support Jean de Montfort. Robert Knowles with his company and John Chandos, a trusted comrade of the Black Prince, with a detachment of archers and men-at-arms, hastened to Brittany. The opponents met near the port town of Auray and formed up in 3 dismounted battles. Charles de Blois and Jean de Montfort were ready to settle matters peacefully, but their allies did not share this desire. Before the battle, Knowles declared to Charles de Blois, "I will rid you of these scoundrels and return the duchy to you." Knowles's cavalry moved into battle first, but its attack was repelled. Then Knowles ordered his archers to dismount and join the infantry. Du Guesclin's left flank was broken and put to flight, and the reserve deserted. As Charles de Blois' positions became encircled, his followers panicked, left the battlefield, or surrendered. Charles himself perished, putting an end to the struggle for power over Brittany. Knowles and Jean de Montfort's victory was complete. 800 followers of Charles de Blois died. 1,000 were captured, including Du Guesclin. When Charles's body was found, Chandos had the captive Du Guesclin brought to it and publicly accused the Breton commander of the nobleman's death. Then he declared to de Montfort, "Sir, look at this scoundrel. Thanks to you, from this day forth he is the Duke of Brittany." However, Du Guesclin's military defeat quickly turned into a diplomatic victory for Charles V Montfort, having won the struggle for the duchy. The day after the battle sent Charles a letter declaring his loyalty to the crown and readiness to pay homage for the duchy. Apart from Brittany, Flanders remained an arena of sharp diplomatic contradictions. Here, a struggle was underway for the hand of Margaret, the sole heiress of Count Louis de Maille, whose domains included not only Flanders but also Artois, Rethel, Nevers, and Imperial Burgundy. A dynastic alliance with Louis would allow Edward III to encircle France with controlled territories. Initially, the English monarch succeeded in October 1364. When Edward's authority was at its zenith, Louis agreed to marry his daughter to the English king's 5th son, Edmund of Langley. However, Charles the Wise had other plans. He used the support of Pope Urban V, who refused the necessary dispensation, and arranged Margaret's marriage to Philip the Bold of Burgundy, which not only thwarted Edward's plans but also undermined his alliance with the Flemish cities. And yet, despite diplomatic successes, a key internal problem persisted. Bands of rowdiers roamed France, with whom the royal army was unable to cope. Chance once again helped Charles get rid of them. In neighboring Castile, a civil war erupted between King Peter the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. Henry appealed to Charles V for help, and he, seeing a chance to place his own candidate on the Castilian throne, ordered Bertrand du Guesclin to recruit as many rowdiers as possible and lead them to the Iberian Peninsula against Peter. Du Guesclin brilliantly succeeded at the head of a 10,000-strong army. He helped Henry achieve victory and expel Peter. However, believing the job done, Henry dismissed the mercenaries as serious miscalculation. The deposed Peter appealed to the Black Prince for help, promising him part of the border Basque lands and full payment of expenses. The Black Prince then had only 2,000 men, but soon his forces multiplied thanks to the very rowdiers Henry had dismissed. From England, a contingent of archers under the command of his younger brother John of Gaunt also arrived to Edward. Crossing the Pyrenees, the Black Prince and Peter headed towards Burgos, the capital of Castile. Henry, meanwhile, chaotically gathered supporters. Du Guesclin advised against engaging the English in battle, advocating guerrilla warfare. But the political situation tied the king's hands. Cities and fortresses surrendered to Edward, and Peter without a fight, and discontent grew in the army. In the end, Henry had no choice but to block the road near the town of Nájera. Henry's 10,000-strong army took up a defensive position by a bridge across a river. The first battle consisted of heavily armed French knights under Du Guesclin, already experienced in fighting the English. But the Spanish knights of the second battle had almost never seen the English. The light Spanish cavalry Jeannettes and light infantry in the rear were not even worth mentioning. The Black Prince's army's 6,000 to 8,000 men had an equally motley composition. At least half were hired routiers, whom the prince left in the second line under his command. The first line consisted of English and Gascon formations led by John of Gaunt, as well as detachments from Navarre and Aragon. Although the sides had been expecting battle for several days, the Black Prince's attack came as a complete surprise. On April 3rd, shortly before dawn, his army quietly left camp and moved along the slope of a long ridge. English banners appeared to the left of Henry's positions, and the Franco-Castilian army had to urgently wheel 45 degrees. The French first line executed the maneuver quickly, but the second line was seized by panic and confusion. Part of the Castilian genets and light infantry switched sides. Du Guesclin, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, decided the only way out was to attack. French men-at-arms, raising shields, moved up the hill under a hail of arrows, which, however, caused little damage. They initially pushed back the attack of John of Gaunt and John Knowles, but failed to gain a decisive advantage. Gradually, the Anglo-Gascons, using numerical superiority, began to surround Du Guesclin's forces from the flanks. Only the intervention of the remaining Castilian forces could save the situation, but they failed to form a unified order. Their attacks were piecemeal. On the left flank, Henry's brother Tello, commanding the light cavalry, tried to help the French but came under archer fire and fled. On the right flank, Henry himself attempted to attack, but his Castilian men-at-arms, taking the order to dismount as an insult, charged on horseback and under the arrow storm halted halfway. In the end, Du Guesclin's French units were isolated. Their resistance was broken within minutes. The remaining infantry threw down their weapons and fled towards Najera. Most perished in the crush on the bridge or under the blows of Aragonese cavalry sent in pursuit. The next morning, heralds counted over 5,000 bodies, an unusually high number for medieval realities. Key commanders of the Franco-Castilian army were captured, including Du Guesclin, who had not even managed to pay his previous ransom after the Battle of Auray. The success of the Black Prince and Peter was marred by Henry's flight from the battlefield back to France. The Castilian campaign of the Black Prince, culminating at Najera, was another military success for the English but a complete failure politically and economically. Peter neither handed over the promised territories nor paid the military expenses, which by the summer of 1367 had reached the astronomical sum of £385,000 sterling. Edward could not pressure Peter. The only positive result was that a pro-English monarch was again on the Castilian throne. But this did not last long. Already in the autumn, Henry and Du Guesclin returned to the Iberian Peninsula, defeated Peter at the Battle of Montiel, and during an attempt at peaceful settlement, Henry personally killed his enemy, ending the dynastic crisis. As with Brittany, Charles the Wise and Du Guesclin managed to turn military defeat into diplomatic victory. And now France could again count on the aid of the Castilian fleet. The subsequent diplomatic games around Brittany, Flanders, and Castile allowed Charles to focus on internal matters. He directed his energy towards reorganizing the tax system. Before 1360, the French financial system consisted of numerous diverse taxes and levies, which were not permanent, involved lengthy negotiations with local representative bodies, and required concessions from the central authority. The unpredictability of collections was a headache for rulers, forced to resort to currency manipulations. The pretext for reforms was the giant ransom for John II under the terms of the Peace of Brittany. In 1360, upon returning from captivity, John by royal decree established the types of nationwide taxes to collect the ransom: the gabelle, an indirect salt tax, and the aides indirect levies on commercial transactions. The ransom collection was initially perceived as a temporary measure, but in 1368, when the sum was almost paid, the gabelle and aides were tacitly recognized as additional war taxes established for an indefinite period. In 1364, by decree of Charles V, the feuillage, or hearth tax, was added to them. The undeniable advantage of the feuillage was its flexibility. It allowed for taking property differences into account and redistributing the tax burden from more affected regions to less affected ones. For example, in 1370, the city of Albi, which had 1,333 hearths, paid the feuage for 140 hearths, having suffered greatly from Roudiers and the English. The rest of Albi's share was paid by other towns in Languedoc. It cannot be said that Charles's tax system was perfect. The nobility and clergy often avoided full payment. However, these measures were a significant step towards creating a more stable and predictable treasury. Thus, in the first 5 years of his reign, Charles the Wise managed to overcome internal turmoil and restore France's international position. The alliance with Castile was renewed, the threat from Charles the Bad eliminated, and Flanders and Brittany wrested from the English sphere of influence. Tax reforms ensured constant revenue to the treasury and even helped form a reserve of 480,000 pounds sterling for waging war. Now it was up to the military to consolidate successes on the battlefield. At the end of 1368, Charles was ready to avenge the humiliating defeats of the war's first decades, and a pretext for resuming hostilities was not long in coming. In Aquitaine and Gascony, discontent with the Black Prince grew. His campaign in Castile 2 years earlier had plunged him into debt, and a new tax he imposed caused outrage among his vassals. The Count of Armagnac, the Count of Périgord, and the Lord of Albret appealed to Charles V formally. Charles had no right to consider complaints from Edward's vassals, as under the Peace of Brittany, Aquitaine had been transferred into sovereign possession. But the king turned the episode into a spectacle. He involved lawyers who argued that, technically, Aquitaine was still part of France, as the ransom for John II had not yet been fully paid. On this basis, Charles summoned the Black Prince to Paris to stand trial. "We will gladly come on the appointed day to Paris," wrote the Black Prince in reply, "but we will come with helmet on head and army at hand." The de facto refusal marked the continuation of the 100 Years' War and the beginning of its second stage, the Caroline War, named after Charles V and his successor Charles VI, as in 1337. Edward III again asserted his claim to the French crown, but this time, hostilities would take a different turn. Accumulated financial resources allowed Charles to immediately mobilize forces and direct them towards reconquering lost territories. Already in 1369, Louis of Anjou launched an offensive, occupying the eastern part of Aquitaine, the counties of Rouergue and Quercy. This was not very difficult. The local population poorly tolerated English rule. In Poitou, the Duke of Berry slowly advanced forward, gradually taking castles. Everywhere, the Black Prince's Gascon garrisons were too small to hold all fortified points, and there was no money to hire new soldiers. Besides a lack of soldiers, the Black Prince faced a problem with experienced commanders. James Audley, a close friend distinguished at Poitiers, died of illness in August 1369. A few months later, John Chandos was killed in battle at Lussac-le-Château, having slipped unfortunately. Now the Black Prince could only move on a litter. By the start of 1370, it became clear that without reinforcements from England, holding Aquitaine would be impossible. Learning of Chandos' death, the English king sent John of Gaunt to help with a detachment of 1,000 archers and men-at-arms. When Gaunt arrived in Angoulême, a sad picture unfolded before him. The administration was paralyzed by a critical lack of funds, and cities and nobles were switching sides to the Valois one after another. Radical measures were needed. Edward and John's new strategy encouraged loyalty. Traitors were given a second chance to return to service. Those who refused were stripped of lands, which were distributed to those who remained loyal. Meanwhile, the summer of 1370 and a new French offensive approached. This time, Louis of Anjou, Jean of Berry, and Bertrand du Guesclin, who had just returned from Castile, planned to strike towards Angoulême, where the ailing Edward was staying. The offensive unfolded successfully. In May, Moissac fell. a fortress that had held the French on the southern direction. Agen soon followed Moissac, allowing Louis to establish control over the confluence of the Lot and Garonne rivers. Farther north, Du Guesclin restored French authority in Périgueux and hastened to strengthen positions. Jean of Berry, meanwhile, began an advance on Limoges. The appointment of the Duke of Berry as commander was one of Charles the Wise's few personnel missteps. The Duke was known as a refined aesthete, a collector of art, jewels, tapestries, manuscripts, and books of hours. This refinement was reflected in his approach to warfare. He preferred negotiations and bribery to battles and sieges. Thus, on his way to Limoges, the Duke corresponded with the local bishop, Jean de Cross, who promised to surrender the city. On the evening of August 21st, Jean of Berry approached Limoges and settled in a nearby Dominican monastery in excellent spirits, expecting the keys to be handed over momentarily. He sent several taunting messages to the Black Prince, urging him to come to the rescue if the prince has the strength and courage. But time passed, and no delegation came from Limoges. The upper town, while fortified, remained loyal to the English. The inhabitants of the lower town hesitated, and the bishop had to spread a false rumor that the Black Prince had died. Meanwhile, news reached the Duke that a large English army was moving towards Limoges from Angoulême, supposedly led by Edward himself. The Duke hastily ordered a withdrawal, leaving in Limoges only a garrison of 200 to 300 men at arms, who took up positions on the walls. As soon as the Black Prince learned of Limoges' surrender, he was filled with determination to recapture the city. He was particularly stung by the bishop's betrayal, as the latter was godfather to his eldest son. According to Froissart, the prince swore by the soul of his father that he would take Limoges back and make the inhabitants pay dearly for their treason. On September 14th, a 1,000-strong Anglo-Gascon army approached the city. The siege was commanded by John of Gaunt, as the Black Prince, due to illness, could not give orders. Discovering that part of the wall was built on soft ground, Gaunt ordered a mine to be dug. While the English advanced through the tunnel, the French dug a counter-mine, and the two trenches connected. In a close-quarters fight by torchlight, Gaunt's men had to retreat. However, Edward and John did not lose resolve. Stone-throwing machines worked on the walls, partially collapsing the fortifications. On September 18th, Gaunt led a detachment to storm through a breach. In hand-to-hand combat on the rubble of the wall, he engaged a French knight and was so impressed by his courage that he stopped and asked him to introduce himself. It was Jean de Villemur, the garrison commander. Gaunt praised him for his bravery and informed him that he had been fighting the Duke of Lancaster himself. In reply, Villemur called himself merely a poor knight and added that he doubted he would ever be so honored. After this chivalric episode, the sides drew back. The next day, September 19th, the besiegers set fire to the wooden supports in the tunnel, causing a section of wall to collapse, and launched a full-scale assault. The garrison withstood the first assault, but the English broke through the gates and, according to Froissart, carried out a massacre in Limoges, known as the Limoges Massacre. It was the most sorrowful deed, wrote the chronicler, when people of all estates, ages, and sexes fell on their knees before the prince and begged for mercy. But he was so angered that he listened to none. They put to the sword all they found, even those who were innocent. On that day, over 3,000 men, women, and children were put to death. Froissart's words stained the Black Prince's reputation, transforming him from a noble lord into a cruel tyrant. However, recently discovered data allow for a different view of events. A charter clearly states that the prince does not blame the townspeople for Jean de Cross's betrayal and fully forgives them. Moreover, it turned out the Black Prince had supporters in Limoges. During the assault, a group of townspeople led by Jacques Baird opened the gates to the English. English historian Michael Jones reconstructs events as follows. Learning of the betrayal, the French garrison attacked the inhabitants. Jacques Baird was executed on the spot and his supporters killed. Then the French began to retreat, setting houses on fire. Realizing what was happening, the English chased the garrison and took no prisoners until the Black Prince and John of Gaunt, impressed by Jean de Villemer's valor, offered the garrison to lay down arms. Some time later, the chief traitor Jean de Cross was brought to Edward, but the prince granted him pardon as well. The siege of Limoges finally exhausted the Black Prince, and in January 1371 he left Aquitaine, never to return. The siege of Limoges undermined Jean of Berry's authority, and the king ordered all his lands confiscated. The defender of Limoges spent the rest of his life in poverty. However, the hostilities of 1370 were not limited to Aquitaine. In response to the French offensive in the southwest, Edward III decided to use a measure that had brought success more than once: conduct a chevauchée through northern France. An army of 4,000 to 5,000 men under Sir Robert Knowles was assembled at Calais. Edward took measures to ensure that Knowles's low feudal status, he was not a hereditary noble, and began service as an archer, did not cause conflict with his more illustrious subordinates Thomas Grandison, Walter Fitzwalter, and John Minsterworth. Before setting out, they all promised in writing to make decisions collectively. In August, Knowles left Calais and moved towards Reims, planning to describe an arc through central regions and approach Paris from the west. Along his path, he launched large-scale plundering operations, at which he excelled. Castles and abbeys refusing to pay ransom had their suburbs destroyed. Inhabitants of weakly fortified settlements were extorted en masse. "How much will you pay us to leave you in peace?" the looters asked. On September 22nd, after 6 weeks of marching, the English army arrived on the left bank of the Seine and formed up before the walls of Paris. Parisian townspeople and the garrison were eager for battle, but the king ordered everyone to stay put. Charles well remembered that previous attempts to stop English raids had ended in disaster and nearly led to a collapse of state authority. The only way out was not to engage in a pitched battle but to act against enemy communications or sit tight behind walls. The new strategy was supported by battle commanders Bertrand du Guesclin, a master of guerrilla warfare, and especially Olivier de Clisson, who told the king, "Sire, let these obsessed ones walk until they tire. They cannot be smoked out of this hole." The strict order of Charles not to make sorties and not to succumb to provocation was carried out. Knowles, realizing he would not get a battle, turned around and moved west, planning to reach Brittany by December and settle into winter quarters there. However, this decision caused irritation among his noble subordinates, who were dissatisfied with the campaign's results and advocated continuing plundering through the winter. They had serious grounds, although the soldiers had signed a 2-year contract. The crown had paid for only 3 months of service. The rest they had to make up through plunder. The lack of booty meant falling morale and mass desertion. In the end, the English commanders failed to reach agreement, and by the end of November, the army disintegrated. Knowles with half the army moved to Brittany. The rest split into 3 independent detachments under Grandison, Fitzwalter, and Minsterworth. They intended to find a fortified point for wintering in Anjou, but these plans were not to be. Bertrand du Guesclin, having gathered 1,000 horsemen in Normandy, set out from Caen on December 1st and raced towards the scattered English detachments. It was then that his talent as a military organizer manifested itself. The horsemen moved at a forced march, covering 50 kilometers a day. By the evening of December 3rd, du Guesclin reached Le Mans and made contact with Marshal Sancerre, preparing to close the trap from the other side. On the morning of December 4th, the English captains were not even aware of the threat. Grandison's corps, about 600 men, was scattered disorderly. Fitzwalter's corps was to the south. The exact location of Minsterworth's corps is unknown. While the English were putting themselves in order, du Guesclin's horsemen rapidly approached their positions, having received a report on the enemy's location the previous night. The constable decided to attack directly from the march, despite the exhaustion of men and horses. He made another march and at dawn reached Pont-Valin. The sudden appearance of Du Guesclin shocked the English. Grandison had time only to form a column and attempt to retreat north in search of higher ground for defense. However, 300 men-at-arms of the French vanguard caught up with the English at the walls of the Château de La Ferte-Bernard and attacked in close formation. Soon the rest of the French units arrived, gradually joining the fight. English archers, constituting about half the army, before the battle could not take up a suitable position, and they had practically no chance of penetrating heavy French armor. Gradually, the advantage of men-at-arms and weaponry began to tell. Despite desperate resistance, the English line thinned and disintegrated. The French showed no mercy. According to Froissart, the English corps was completely destroyed, and its commanders, including Grandison, were captured to a man. But Du Guesclin had no intention of stopping. After issuing orders regarding the prisoners, he hurried south, where Fitzwalter's corps was presumably located. Fitzwalter, who had learned of Grandison's catastrophe, had no intention of sharing his fate. At the head of his men, he rushed towards the large and fortified Abbey of Vaz, held by an English garrison. No sooner had the English ridden into the abbey grounds than French horsemen under Marshal Sancerre approached from the other side. The marshal ordered an immediate attack, and a fierce battle unfolded on the walls. With nightfall, the French broke into the inner courtyard and carried out a massacre. Organizing a retreat proved impossible. Losses added another 300 killed and an unknown number captured. Fitzwalter, like Grandison, was captured. Meanwhile, to the south, Du Guesclin's detachments hunted the remnants of Knowles's army. 400 Englishmen who had crossed the Loire tried to hide in Poitou, but Du Guesclin caught up with them near Bressuire and cut them down. John Minsterworth and his men hurried with all their might to Brest to cross to England, but a detachment of Du Guesclin followed on their heels, losing half its force in rearguard skirmishes. As for Knowles, he settled into winter quarters at Derval in his own castle, where he calmly waited out the hot phase of events. The significance of the French victory at Pont Valin proved greater than could be expected. From a minor skirmish, it put an end to the myth of English invincibility in open battle, which for many years had been Edward III's key diplomatic trump card. On the other hand, the December campaign became Du Guesclin's finest hour and proof of his abilities. In about 2 weeks, he covered several hundred kilometers, moving at night and pouring rain in the middle of winter. With the speed of his movements, quality of reconnaissance, and boldness of decisions, he thwarted the key English campaign of 1370 and not only defeated, but destroyed a 1,000-strong army. I tell you, a Breton knight declared to Froissart, the Constable Bertrand was a valiant man who in his time accomplished great deeds. In the name of France, by the beginning of 1371, both sides were severely exhausted, and active military operations resumed only in 1372. This time, the main target of the French offensive was chosen to be the county of Poitou, the richest of Edward III's continental possessions. The local nobility remained loyal to the English crown, but the loyalty of the towns, especially the capital Poitiers, was in question. This forced Capital de Butch, in charge of the county's defense, to allocate many soldiers to serve and for main garrisons at Poitiers, Thouars, Niort, and Roche-sur-Yon. As a result, Jean de Grailly had only a few hundred men at his disposal to parry French actions. The only hope was financial aid from England. In June, Edward sent a fleet to Aquitaine, carrying £12,000 sterling, enough to pay an army for 4 months. Meanwhile, Capital de Butch holed up in Poitiers, awaiting reinforcements. The French acted quickly. The Duke of Berry moved towards Poitiers, while Bertrand du Guesclin with a detachment of horsemen devastated the valleys of eastern Poitou. All river crossings fell into French hands. Simultaneously, Olivier de Clisson laid siege to Moncontour, the only English fortress with a large garrison in northern Poitou. The French stormed it and blockaded the enemy in the citadel. The garrison capitulated. Meanwhile, the English fleet with finances for debauch approached La Rochelle. The fleet commander, the Earl of Pembroke, expected to meet no one but pirates. So 14 transport barges were escorted by only 3 warships. But instead of a warm welcome in La Rochelle harbor, the English found a Castilian fleet, which Henry of Trastamara had sent in support of the French 12 warships, 8 of which were massive carracks with ballista and many crossbowmen. After the Battle of Najera, a contemptuous attitude towards the Castilians as warriors had spread among the English, and despite the enemy's overwhelming firepower superiority, the Earl of Pembroke gave a suicidal order to attack. In the clash, the entire English fleet was sunk, Pembroke was captured, and the £12,000 ended up on the seabed. The Battle of La Rochelle was smaller in scale than Sluys or Winchelsea, but its effect was disproportionately great. The defeat led to a serious drop in English prestige, and many Poitevin towns, particularly Poitiers itself, opened their gates to the Duke of Berry. The loss of finances deprived debauch of any hope of repelling the onslaught. Having no other options, Jean decided to gamble and defeat the enemy piecemeal with rapid strikes. But the initiative had completely passed to the French. On the night of August 22nd to 23rd, in the Battle of Soubise, the Anglo-Gascon army was defeated by Olivier de Clisson's forces. Debauch was captured and languished in prison. Until his death in 1377, English resistance in Poitiers rapidly crumbled. On September 8th, the townspeople of La Rochelle surrendered the city. Angoulême soon surrendered. The wars fell later after a long defense. Even the Poitevin nobility, which had remained loyal the longest, finally submitted and paid homage to Charles V. He granted a general amnesty, returned confiscated estates, and confirmed privileges. The reconquest of Poitou was successfully completed. The last significant attempt to turn the tide of the conflict was undertaken by the English in 1373. A 1,000-strong army under John of Gaunt was to carry out the largest plundering raid, later called the Great Chevauchée, landing at Calais. The army divided into 2 columns and moved south through France on parallel paths. Clearly angered by the loss of Aquitaine, John of Gaunt wrote an angry letter to Charles the Wise. "Do not be surprised when I come to do evil to you and your subjects in revenge for the deprivation I have suffered by your fault." But despite Gaunt's provocative behavior, Charles continued to avoid a pitched battle, allowing his commanders only to harass English rear areas and foraging parties. Gradually, the Great Chevauchée turned into a severe ordeal for the English soldiers. Gaunt's army dwindled day by day and barely withstood the daily raids by de Guesclin's men. Gaunt could not turn west near Paris. As Knowles had done, he had to go deeper into France, where unwalled cities were preparing to encircle the English. Gaunt had to leave the entire baggage train behind to avoid encirclement. But the worst was yet to come. Moving across the Limousin Plateau in late autumn, Gaunt's soldiers found themselves in one of France's most inhospitable regions, a cold, sparsely populated land of dense forests where a large army had no chance of feeding itself. Rain poured down, turning roads into swamps. Foraging became impossible. Soldiers were forbidden to stray from the main force, and those who ignored the order were destroyed by the constable's men. The path Gaunt's army followed was littered with the corpses of starved horses and pieces of armor. The English discarded to lighten their load.